You versus the guy she tells you not to worry about. Ahoy! My name is SLOTH, and never has this intro been more fitting, because today we're talking about the new Sea of Thieves update, A Pirate's Life, which is a Pirates of the Caribbean, or Jack Sparrow update, if you will. Captain Jack Sparrow, that is. So why am I making this video? Because I was actually really excited about this update. As many of you may know, I used to play Sea of Thieves when the game originally came out, and to this day, one of my most successful videos is actually a Sea of Thieves video. I can actually even flex being one of the less than 200 people they follow on Twitter, although I'm not so sure if that'll still be the case after this video. Back when I played, the biggest problem of Sea of Thieves was the severe lack of content, especially content that would have any sort of streamlining to it, any story or anything in terms of depth. I briefly returned to the game last year, but not for long, so really this is my first time that I've been diving into the game on a more substantial level since I first played it. As such, my impressions here are from the perspective of a returning player, and I played it solo because everyone I know either doesn't play it anymore or was already playing in a party. This video will contain very minor spoilers of Chapter 1 and 2 of this update, but honestly, not much more than you've already seen in the trailer because there isn't really that much to spoil. I guess that in itself is a little bit of a spoiler. I'm going to go through this mostly chronologically in the way that it's played in-game, so you get a decent understanding of how my experience was. The first important thing actually happens before you get into the game, because you have to choose your experience. And you can choose between using the adventure mode, where you sail freely across the waves, or a pirate's life, where you play an epic pirate adventure. Now obviously I chose the second option here, but this is going to be very important later, because it doesn't quite make sense. If you choose this, you get placed at an outpost with your ship, where you're introduced to the castaway who will be your quest giver. Now here's the thing. Apparently, this collaboration was led by Disney in that they gave instructions on how exactly the experience would be, and they kind of wanted it to be similar to Disneyland from what I've been told. So in many ways it's supposedly laid out like a ride where you just kind of along for it, and that is most certainly true for the beginning of this quest. I went back and checked the timestamps, and the introduction talk before you actually do anything, where you just wait and get introduced to the story, goes on for 3.5 minutes. That to me was a very odd opening, because when you're really excited to try something new, then the last thing you want to do is stand around and wait for a long dialogue to finish, in my opinion. Especially when the same dialogue could have been done in the next part, because what happened next is I was on a ship for 4.5 minutes in order to go into an instanced area, then have some visual things happening around me that didn't really have any impact on the story or anything beyond that. Just, to set the vibe. So with the exception of briefly steering my ship vaguely in the right direction, I was a passenger on this ride for the first 8 minutes. And keep in mind that there was no dialogue in the second half of it, so it could have easily been combined where you have the atmospheric part that happens around you while the quest giver narrates the story. Now you may say that's unfitting if she's not on the boat with you, but A, she could have easily been placed on the boat, and B, there are other voices in your head later in the story, so it's not even like they are scared of doing that. So this was a very strange first taste of what was yet to come, especially when considering that you would expect some company like Disney would get their story writing right. So after the theme park ride, you end up in an instanced area where you are to complete your next quests. This is super linear and very pre-scripted, very pre-written, which is kind of unusual from my previous experience with Sea of Thieves, but not unwelcome here. I think that was one of the things that Sea of Thieves used to lack, because they said everyone should make their own adventures, which led to it being a little bit too sandboxy in the beginning and also sounding a little bit like an excuse. But this area was definitely a stark contrast to that. The narration switched to a voice in my head, and I had to solve a variety of different, relatively simple puzzles. Usually they consisted of figuring out a mechanic once, like for example using a torch to activate something, and then using that mechanic in other places again to open certain doors. The difficulty of these puzzles mostly came from finding the right thing in dimly lit areas, so make of that what you will. It wasn't terrible, but it also wasn't particularly innovative puzzling in my opinion. Some of the puzzles were also weirdly slow, where you find out that you have to use a certain pulley or rope and then you pull on it basically forever until what you want to achieve is actually executed. In some parts you simply had to find out the right path, in others you had to light up flames, you had to pull levers, cut ropes, or collect keys, and that was basically about it. Meanwhile, the narrator would constantly yell "Dead men tell no tales" into your ears, until eventually, plot twist, he told you that dead men in fact do tell tales because you can find out what happened to them. Eventually you come across a talking skull that you need to free from a cage, and this part was so ironic that I'm not sure if that was on purpose, but they never really reflected on the irony or never pointed out that they were aware of it, because you have to free the skull from the cage, but the cage is actually so large that you could just easily pull it out of it, but you still have to find the key. If this was self-aware humor and it was just never pointed out, then it was actually well done, but there was no indication of that at all. So it just feels like they're completely oblivious to the fact how ridiculous that quest part was. Either way, it definitely got a good laugh out of me. I have to say that the story that we got here was relatively weak though. It was mostly about a greedy captain that fell to a curse, and then it was about dead men actually telling tales, and that was basically it. I'll be honest, I was hoping for a little more depth or at least humor here, because humor is also a big part of Pirates of the Caribbean. This entire area, which takes you quite a while to complete, also has absolutely no combat, so you're kinda just using the mechanic of walking for the most part and sometimes interacting with things. The visuals here were nice, but also not overly impressive by Sea of Thieves standards. Especially the fog effect gets a little bit annoying after a while when you know how gorgeous the skies in Sea of Thieves can normally be. Instead, most things are covered in a relatively dull green. The music, however, is great. It's honestly one of the DLC's most redeeming features. Every tediousness of these tasks is somewhat offset by the fact that there's nice music in the background at least. Now after all that, we're finally introduced to the main story. We're introduced to Captain Jack Sparrow as well as Davy Jones to some degree. And the first battle takes place. Here we finally get some combat. Unfortunately, the execution of this combat is extremely odd. On one hand, there's the enemy ship that we need to shoot with cannonballs in order to damage it, though it is not clear what exactly you need to do here. It is not really clear what impact the cannonballs have, how many times you need to shoot or anything. Eventually, you get to a part where you have to fight off some enemies that try to board your ship, and these are new types of enemies that I at least have never seen before, and they are not introduced at all. You're thrown at 3 different types of enemies all at once, so you basically have no time to learn their attack patterns or anything or understand one of them first, so I honestly just ended up slashing with my sword until they were dead, and it kinda worked out. But at the same time, it doesn't even matter if you learn how to fight them either, because there are no repercussions to dying. So eventually there was this crab on my ship that did this AoE attack over and over, and I couldn't figure out how to avoid it, but I just died and respawned and kept fighting them, and it made no difference whatsoever. I was glad that there was finally some combat, but the combat itself felt very uninspired and uncreative. The furthest level of depth I could find is that the enemies had certain weak points, but again, the fights were too short to even figure that out further. Following that, I once again got dropped into a long cutscene, followed by a long dialogue from the quest giver. Just what I wanted at that point, as you can imagine. But so far I had been accepting of all of this. Maybe this was just the build-up to the deeper story, maybe you just needed this introduction to really get going. Well, enter Chapter 2. With the dialogue out of the way, the next part was to find a certain area. This in itself would have been extremely frustrating if it wasn't for the fact that I had some Twitch viewers that actually know how these things work in Sea of Thieves. Because I actually had to go in my inventory, specifically to the quest items, in order to find the right hints for the information that I needed. The dialogue that introduced me to this was once again 3 minutes long, and all she said at some point of the dialogue was, "Take these papers and study them." No further indication of how exactly to do that. I guess if you're a long-term Sea of Thieves player, this particular aspect is not a problem, but if you're a returning player and the mechanic wasn't in the game when it first came out, you have no way of knowing this. Through this quest, I then found a location on the map. And here, it is once again important that before I got into the game, I chose the adventure mode. But that didn't matter here, because other players were in the game as well. It was the normal open world sailing experience. After the previous very linear quest part, this felt super out of place, because it meant that I would have to sail down to the location, which took more than 15 minutes, and I got hit by a thunderstorm on the way. Those random encounters may be fun when you're just exploring the world or you're just getting some loot, but if you're just trying to get to the next part of a storyline quest, it is all but fun. I generally think for storylines like this, a fast travel option of some sort should be introduced, since it just is completely disruptive to the story that you go with before, and suddenly you just have this long waiting period basically. But up until this point, everything was still relatively bearable. It wasn't exactly my definition of fun, but it was something that I would have accepted if what was coming afterwards would have made up for it. If. Instead, I got the worst experience that I ever had in my entire time of playing Sea of Thieves. Once you find the location that you're required to go to, which is very easy because it actually has a visual effect at that point, you have to dive down to the bottom of the sea. When I arrived in the area, multiple other ships were around as well, because obviously everyone else was doing this quest too. This was concerning for me, but since I didn't have any kind of loot, I figured it wouldn't be a major issue. I started diving to the bottom of the sea and followed a trail of debris and wood pieces. Eventually I saw someone else using quick chat and then showing up next to me in a bubble. Didn't fight them, obviously there was no reason to, we were all there for the quest. They kept diving further down and I followed them, though I was a little slower. The dive to the bottom took quite a while and was honestly a bit boring, but once at the bottom I was rewarded with a pretty nice sight. I found the place where I had to pick up the next item, and I was about to get it when the other player that I had seen before decided to attack me. They were a much more experienced player and made short work of me, and I also didn't have the right weapon equipped in the first place. So I was dead and I figured, well, this is gonna be great, I'm gonna have to dive all the way down again. It got worse. The enemy player was with a friend, and while one of them had taken me out, the other one had set my ship on fire and sent it off to the edge of the map. The other player had intentionally waited until I was all the way at the bottom, so that the ship would be further away when I'm dead. No quick save while at the bottom, and no way to avoid other players while doing this part of the quest. That felt like pretty bad quest design to me for a quest where Rare is most certainly aware that some people will just grief even if there's no reward in it. That is just the nature of Sea of Thieves and has always been, and they have not actively discouraged that, and now they introduce a new story-based chapter where new players will come into the game and a lot of old players that haven't played in a long time will return. And obviously there's going to be some trolls abusing that, and they make fundamental parts of the quest line open world with other players. Really bad idea, but it gets worse. So I sail back, I see them on the ship, I fight them, I die again because, again, they're much more experienced. They then try to board my ship and I actually win that fight. That opens up a window for me to dive down again and continue with the quest, hoping that they won't follow me right after respawning. I get the necessary items for the next part of the quest and I continue my journey hoping that I can just avoid these other players. Then the quest proceeds into an area that seems like it's instanced, so other players outside of your party shouldn't be able to access it. Because to even get into it, you have to specifically select it in the quest. I get into that area and something is kind of off. There is this large open underwater space, which honestly looks pretty cool, where I need to do something, but for some reason there isn't any bubbles around where I could get air. I have to either dive all the way back to the entrance or all the way up to what seems like an exit. Between these distances, it feels like there's hardly any time to even complete the task that I'm required to do in that area, which initially isn't clear to me. So I start diving and trying to figure it out when I see some familiar faces. The players, of which one had been killing me before, are now in this area as well, so it's clearly not instanced. Of course, being two very experienced players, they decide to kill me once again, and this continues whenever I respawn. I hardly have a chance to do anything, especially because most of the fight takes place underwater, where your dodging is very, very limited. I keep hoping that they eventually leave so I can continue with the quest and learn a little bit more about that, but they don't. And I initially thought that they might just be griefing me on purpose, but after what I learned now, that might not even have been the case. This may have been entirely Sea of Thieves' fault. After spending enough time on the Ferry of the Dead, I decide to go for another option. I leave the server and rejoin in order to be free of these players. Now obviously at this point my concern is that I will have to redo the entire quest chain, but when I respawn at an outpost, I actually get the option to pick up the quest where I left it off. I think great, I'm gonna get teleported to the last part of the quest and then continue from there without being griefed. Only that I don't. I get the items from the quest, but I have to move all the way back to the location again. Fortunately, I spawned at a closer outpost, so the sailing didn't take as long, but once again, I couldn't care less about sailing around when I want to do these quests, and I still had to do it from the outpost, and then I still had to do the entire dive down to this same area again, which I already had to do twice before, mind you, because I was killed the first time I went down there. So after diving down for the third time, now incredibly bored and frustrated with this whole thing, I go back into the seemingly instanced area, only to find that I seem to be unable to solve the riddle. What happened? Well, apparently it's a bug. I'm not sure if it's meant to be instanced as a whole, but the area is not supposed to be flooded initially. You're supposed to initiate the flooding by using the symbols on the wall and aligning certain statues. If the area is already flooded, then you can't continue with the quest. And the funny thing is that the suggestion to fix this is to leave the server and go on another server, which is exactly what I did to avoid the griefers, only that it didn't solve the issue either. So while these other players were most certainly griefers who killed me over and over for no reward, they weren't necessarily in that area just to kill me. They were probably stuck on the same glitched quest. And after that I honestly just caved and gave up. I can understand and forgive a slow and maybe somewhat boring introduction to a storyline that is somewhat uninspired, but not necessarily horrible, but this whole thing was incredibly poorly thought out. I spent roughly half of my playtime doing things unrelated to actually playing through the quest, be it getting my ship there or trying to respawn, all of which could have easily been avoided by making this an instanced quest line all the way through. And that seems entirely logical when you specifically have to select a dedicated mode for it. Otherwise, what is the purpose of that mode? Additionally, with a major collaboration like this, I would expect it to be significantly more polished. Aside of the janky smaller glitches I had along the way, such a massive game-breaking bug that doesn't let you progress with the story at all and puts you in a situation where you can be griefed by other players is incredibly frustrating as a returning player. And this is more than one issue. Either they didn't implement instancing for this part of the quest, which would be terrible, or the instancing isn't working, and in addition to that, the quest is overriding between different player groups, and when this overriding happens, then other players can't even pick up from that point and finish the quest. This whole thing also made me feel like Rare just doesn't know their own game or their own player base. Did they really think in what will be the most popular quest line of the near future, people would not find ways to troll if they're put in contact with other players? Or did they really think that the players who want to play through the quest line would enjoy these encounters? Because both would be extremely foolish. Overall, A Pirate's Life really doesn't have any redeeming qualities that would make up for its significant downsides and shortcomings all the way through. Even the visual appeal is low by Sea of Thieves' otherwise high standards, and if it's just for the music, I'd rather listen to that on Spotify than play through this again. The only really entertaining moment of my journey was when I found that skull and I had to free him from a cage, and I'm still not sure if that was an intentional joke. As it is with Sea of Thieves, this might be more fun as a multiplayer experience. That is often the case. By playing it as a solo player for the story part of it, it's in my opinion absolutely not worth sitting through the pain. Especially when at the moment you're likely going to hit a brick wall where you can't progress anyways. They also have a bunch of other bugs with similar issues where you can't get progression further than that. It doesn't make me happy at all to leave this sort of review when I really had the hope that after such a long time, Sea of Thieves would be living up to its potential more, having those story-driven parts and a big name for a collaboration. I don't want to point fingers here because I really don't know if it's Rare who's responsible for most of this or if this was more in Disney's hands, but either way, I'd rather be playing with a jar of dirt. But that's it for this very disappointed review. If you're new to the channel, feel free to click the sub button and maybe the bell so you get notified of other videos. And other than that, I hope to see you for the next one soon. And thanks to my patrons for making this video possible. That's That Nick Walker, Dwayne Brennan, Lenta25 Green, Zelaria, Zed the Undead, Nevis Jr., Rawas, Angel, Erix88, Zifaroli, and everyone else you see here. Thank you guys so much. Duke Sloth, out.